Welcome back to part two of our look into Turkish economics. In part one, to set the stage, we talked about the differences between theory and practice of interest rates and inflation. So if you haven't listened to that or you need a refresher, I recommend you revisit that episode. Here in part two, we'll discuss the prescriptive options for Turkey and how those prescriptions apply to Western developed nations. To kick things off, here's the final thoughts from part one. Let's have a listen. Okay, well, we just explained why classical theory doesn't apply here based on the Curtis LeMay effect. So you're probably thinking, okay, well, let's close up shop. We got it. Erdogan clearly is right, and he should lower interest rates. I mean, we just spent I don't know how long, but we talked about all the underlying conditions why he should be lowering the interest rate. It makes more sense. Well, actually, despite everything I just said, I agree with the classical economists. He should be raising the interest rates. Come on. Don't bullshit me. It's always said the scariest words in the English language they hear is, I am from the government and I'm here to help. Welcome to Come On, Don't Bullshit Me, where we peel away the messaging of talking heads to get to the crux of today's issues. Well, first off, let's address the elephant in the room. As of the recording of this podcast, Erdogan announced that he's going to guarantee the bank account of the Turkish Lira to Turkish citizens. It's basically the Turkish equivalent of a FDIC. And on this news, the value of the lira shot up. Now, whether this is going to hold or not, I don't know. I doubt it will, my personal opinion, but what matters is the reality. But the funny thing about this, though, is that, again, we already established that Erdogan hates interest rates. And interest rates, it's not like the bank is like, nomine patris et filius spiritus sanctus, and then the interest rates go up, right? Or I guess in Erdogan's case, it would be Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and then the interest rates go up, right? For the interest rates to go up, what happens is that it's different in the United States nowadays after quantitative easing, but generally speaking for central banks, and in the case for Turkey, what would happen is to raise interest rates, the central bank has to sell bonds, right? So what happens is the primary dealers or the main banks at the central bank who have accounts at the central bank give money to the central bank. So that money is removed from the economy. And in exchange, they get bonds that gives an interest payment. And those bonds, by virtue of being bonds, are also not in the economy. It's like a savings account, right? And because there's less money in the economy, well, then presumably inflation will drop, right? And that's what the classical economics theory it's taught. See, but that actually is not the case because it's not like the bonds are being issued by the central bank. It's issued by the Treasury Department of the country in question. So those bonds are already out there. They're already issued. So it's a question of, are the interest payments going to be paid to the central bank, right, to the Fed, which because by virtue of the fact the central bank is effectively outside the economy, those interest payments don't do anything, or those interest payments are going to go to the banks themselves, which actually are in the economy. And the best way I can explain this, I don't know why I keep going back to food or Italy or Italian food, but anyway, you know about the espresso machines? So let me give you a story about espresso machines. When I was stationed in Italy, we had a lot of downtime, and that's not a knock against Italy saying, "Oh, Italians don't work, so you got a lot of downtime." No, it's just there's this expression: war is it's sudden bursts of chaos with long periods of boredom. So during those long periods of boredom, for some reason, I decided to read macroeconomics textbooks to try to understand the economy. But the way I kind of visualized the economics was staring at my surroundings. And for my surroundings, which is in the break room at the command center, or the ops center, as we call it in the Air Force, was a barista. And he would fill out the entire base's orders, basically, because everyone would come over to the break room, and he would fill out all the orders of all the coffees. And me being an American, not really being exposed to the Italian coffee culture, it was my first time seeing a proper real espresso machine. I didn't really even know what an espresso was because I was that culturally inept. But I would see it's almost like an art form, the grinding of the beans and putting it in the machine and getting it with the pressing of the grounds and then the extraction of the coffee. It was really mesmerizing. It was kind of like watching a classical music orchestra. It's simultaneously boring but mesmerizing. So the way I was able to imprint the economy into my brain was basically that the entire espresso machine is the economy. And the top of the machine, where all the coffee beans are and whatnot, that's the government. And the amount of beans you put in, that's what's going to go ultimately turn into coffee. And it's essentially what the Treasury Department spends, right? The government, your government, is going to spend based on either if it's an autocracy, it's dictated, or if you're a democracy, it's some sort of parliament or congressional laws passed, and that's how the payments happen. And this is kind of like what we were talking about with the government printing the bonds. The bonds, as we said, could either end up with the Fed or in the general economy. And in the espresso machine, you have the multiple spouts. So generally, you have two spouts. And with the two spouts, you can either put two espresso cups and then fill two orders at one time, or you put one giant cup in there and then get both of the streams into that one cup, and then you can make a doppio, as they say in Italy. So this is kind of like how the way the bonds and the interest payments work, right? Because the bonds are being issued by the central government and not the central bank, right? There's a distinction between government and bank. So the central government is going to issue the bonds based on whatever laws are passed. And the central bank is kind of like the barista in charge of putting the cups underneath the spouts. And by lowering the interest rate, what you do is you're essentially putting two cups in there where some of the money is going into the economy, like in one cup, and the other is because by virtue of the fact that you have low interest rates. And again, like we said, low interest rates means the Fed, or the central bank in broader terms, has bought a lot of those bonds, means those interest payments are going into the central bank. And of course, then it gets recycled back to the central government and essentially wash it's outside the economy, right? Whereas when you raise the interest rates, those bonds are now, rather than being locked up in the central bank, are now back in the economy. So in this case, it's kind of like with the espresso machine analogy, rather than having two cups for the two spouts, you're putting one giant cup underneath the machine, and both spouts are going to that one cup. The government payments of interest payments are going to happen regardless of what happens with the central bank, because that's determined by law, or in authoritarian regimes by decree. And the only thing that the central bank can do is divert those payments either into or out of the economy. And that's the key point here, is that interest rates are not raised by decree. Raising interest rates is done through the buying or the selling of bonds by the central bank. And all that does is divert already existing central government coupon payments, right? Because the bonds are already issued. The coffee is already ground. It's going to come out of the spout regardless. It's either going to go into a separate cup or into the drip tray, right? Or it's going to go into the actual espresso cup that's being served, or in economic sense. If the central bank raises the interest rates, that means all those bonds that were locked away from the economy are now actually in the economy, and the constant interest payments that are being paid, regardless of it's in the central bank or in the commercial banks, the Treasury Department of the central government is paying the money on the interest of these bonds. And now, because they're not locked away in the central bank, but actually all that money is being issued to the commercial banks, well, that's more money that's actually going to the economy, and more money just increases the price level, so it increases inflation. So a higher interest rate actually, contrary to what classical economics states, increases inflation. And again, like I said before, this is perfectly evidenced by both Argentina and Japan as classic examples here of this. In Argentina, they've raised interest rates thinking classically that it's going to reduce inflation, but inflation has been going up. And Japan, again, the opposite is that they've lowered their interest rate and the interest rates have been lower. And plus all the other things that we've been talking about with the price level increasing because of the time lag of trade financing. So this is the thing that Erdogan is against, right? What he's saying is he's against interest rates. And again, whether it's because of Islamic theory or not, that's immaterial. The point is he's against interest rates, which functionally means he's against the central bank giving bonds to the economy. And when the central bank gives bonds to the economy, what does that mean? That means the central government, the Treasury Department, rather than giving these coupons to the central bank, which is immaterial to the economy, that interest payments on those bonds is being given to the commercial economy. So by him saying, I am against raising interest rates, he is functionally saying, I am against injecting money into the economy. But what is this buyback, or what is this central government guarantee that he just announced yesterday functionally doing? Well, he's saying that if the price of the lira falls, well, I'm going to give you more lira to guarantee the conversion to the foreign currency. Well, functionally, that's exactly the same thing as interest rates. So this whole thing about him saying, oh, I'm against interest rates, well, he's actually doing the very thing that he's saying that he's not going to do, which from a classical theory standpoint, the classical economists recognize as saying, yeah, okay, whatever, Erdogan, you can say whatever the hell you want, but you just said you're going to increase interest rates. So for us, that's good news. And that's why the lira shot up. So he's actually doing the things that the foreign investors want to do. Now, all that aside, again, because this is just the funny little anecdote, but more broadly, again, like I said, despite the fact that classical economics is not applicable to the Turkish environment and raising interest rates will just raise inflation, I still think raising interest rates is the right thing to do. Because like I said earlier, controlling inflation is not the end-all be-all of governing an economy or managing an economy. It's about facilitating the goods and services and providing for the citizens. And right now, with Turkish people struggling so much with the shambles of an economy, they need capital flow. And again, the capital flow is not coming because the foreign investors aren't coming. Because of the risky business and all the things that we've been discussing for this entire episode. So the only way to get the funding to facilitate the flow of the Turkish economy is to attract foreign investment. And right now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, what that means is the central bank has to raise interest rates, not because it's going to help with inflation, but because it's going to help attract foreign investment. Because right now, what Turkey needs is foreign investment, because the Turkish lira is an ineffective medium for facilitating trade within the country. You need the foreign investment, unfortunately. And the only way to attract that foreign investment is to raise the interest rate to match the perceived risk premium that is in investing in Turkey. We also could say politically, things that Erdogan could do is become more liberal, less autocratic. But obviously, you see that's a tall order, and that's not really going to happen. We'll see that happening when pigs fly. Now, all that being said, there's some other reasons. A lot of people write off what Erdogan is proposing, as in, oh, he's either being senile, he doesn't understand economic theory, or because he's Muslim and he's just trying to create a Sharia theocracy and dismantle the secular institution of the Republic of Turkey. And, that's fine. We can get into like conspiracy theories and all that. But there's a lot of economic reasons for why he's proposing these things that we need to consider, which may not necessarily help the Turkish situation, but definitely help understand why he's espousing the situations that he's in. Well, one thing is that, like we just said, that he needs to attract foreign investment. And in order to attract foreign investment, one way to do that again is to raise the interest rates to match the perceived risk premium. The other way to attract foreign investment is through currency swaps. And Turkey has been doing a lot of this with China. This is part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. They're trying to increase their economic and political influence throughout the world. Good on them. Every country has the right to do that. But the way these currency swap deals work is that Turkey and China are swapping their currency. And not only they're swapping their currency, but they're also swapping the interest rates. And we got to look at this from the perspective of Erdogan. He has an election coming up in 2023, and he's a populist autocrat, so he relies on populism to get him forward. And with the economy the way it is, he either needs to improve the economy or find someone to blame. And also, the 2023 election is actually very important to him because, again, as this moderate Islamist or whatever you want to call him, but this theocratic light person that Erdogan is, it's no big secret. He detests Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, and more specifically, the secular institution that he built within the Turkish Republic. And 2023 will be the 100th year anniversary of the founding of the Turkish Republic. So him being at the helm, being able to say at the centennial anniversary of the Turkish Republic, I have restored the Islamic glory of Turkey, is something that's very much on his mind. So that's all one of the reasons why, from a rhetoric standpoint, he's really leaning into this whole interest is a bad thing, interest is haram. It's not condoned in the Quran. So there's that. But from a functional standpoint, the economy, as bad as it is right now, because of the current Turkish lira depreciation, it can actually be a lot worse. Because one of the things that Erdogan is doing is that whatever reserves, dollar, euro reserves that the Turkish government has, they're selling that to prop up the Turkish lira. Obviously, they're not doing a good job because the Turkish lira is skyrocketing. But the point is that they're actually trying to prop up the Turkish lira by selling these foreign reserves, by selling US dollars to at least not make it as bad as it really could be. And right now, a lot of economists are saying this is that, oh, well, Turkish reserves are diminishing. It's pretty low. But what they're referring to is the gross foreign reserves, the gross amount of US dollars. But if you take away the currency swap deals that Turkey has made over the couple of years, they actually have a net negative balance. So while the gross reserve balance is positive, their net balance is negative. And that means removing the currency swap deals that they're having. So basically, with the currency swap deal that Turkey has made with China, for example, this summer, they made a $6 billion, it was worth $6 billion of a currency swap, where basically the Turkish government gave $6 billion worth of Turkish lira and the corresponding Turkish lira interest to China. And then the Chinese government would give $6 billion worth of Chinese yuan plus the Chinese interest rate to Turkish government. And of course, how this works is that you have that foreign currency of your partner, which means now it makes it easier for you to facilitate trade. Of course, this is good in the sense that from both standpoints, because China is a net exporter, so they want people to use the yuan so that they will buy Chinese products. And Turkey, by, as we just discussed, necessarily being a net importer, they need to buy stuff. And if they have Chinese yuan, they're locked in with that currency, so they can easily facilitate the importing of Chinese goods. But another part of this, again, it's not just the principal that's being swapped, but the interest rates. And if Erdogan, again, the economy is already bad as it is, and people are suffering, losing jobs, they're already angry, right? But it could be a lot worse when Turkey does not have the foreign reserves to sell to prop up the Turkish lira. So essentially, because he's refusing to raise the interest rates, The only way he can get foreign reserves, particularly because Turkey's a net importing nation, is through these currency swap deals. And China, obviously, with the desperation of Turkey's in, China's in a pretty good situation where for the swap, they don't want a high interest rate. They're going to obviously negotiate with Erdogan and say, no, keep the interest rate low because if we're going to do these swaps, if you want our yuan, if you want our foreign reserves, you need to keep the interest rate low because we want to pay you a low rate during the swap deal. So that's another issue. It's kind of overlooked right now is that as bad as the Turkish lira is, it could be a whole lot worse without the infusion of foreign capital through these currency deals. And the only way these currency deals, these other countries are going to give that to them is they keep the interest low because it's in their interest to have a low interest. So Turkey is in a really messed up position right now. Erdogan's stuck between a rock and a hard place because he really should be raising interest rates to attract the foreign capital needed to kickstart the economy back up. But he can't because he's being held hostage by these currency swap deals where the rates have to be low so that he can get the foreign reserves needed to prop up the lira. Because if he doesn't prop up the lira, the situation is going to go from bad to worse. And then from the domestic standpoint, Erdogan also has considerations where he's replaced the old oligarchy with a new oligarchy. And that new oligarchy is in construction business. Part of his removing of the old guard, if you will, was giving his cronies cheap investments in construction. And this is one of the things that even classic economists would say is that lowering interest rates means you're obviously not getting as much of a return as you would normally want from those bonds. So what does that do? That's a capital flight to other assets. And one of the primary assets that people give flight to is construction, the real estate. And with his cronies, the oligarchy that he's created revolves around construction. So for the past decade or so, there's been constant construction projects going around all over Turkey and Istanbul right now. There's so many. I don't know how true this is, but people are saying that there's more skyscrapers in Istanbul than any country or any city in Europe or America, which is freaking insane. And most of these construction projects, they're empty now. This is another situation that we're seeing in the Middle East and China as well, is that a lot of these wealthy investors that want to park their wealth parked it in dubious real estate investments. And a lot of skyscrapers or what have you are half constructed because they just take the money and run. And that situation is no different than in Turkey and specifically in Istanbul. They had tons of construction projects, and with the fact that a low interest rate boosts the value of that real estate because again, there's a capital flight from fixed assets, from bonds to real estate. And if Erdogan is going to stay in power, he obviously needs to satisfy his cronies, his oligarchy. And with that oligarchy being centered around construction, well, not only do they rely on the low interest rates from a speculative standpoint, because people are more likely to invest in their construction projects, but also, again, going back to that revolving debt nature, is that they're constantly relying on new debt, on new domestic debt in this case, because these are just domestic construction projects. And because they're not actually collecting any returns from these dubious construction projects because they're just sitting there empty, they need to finance their wealth with revolving credit. And increasing the interest rates is only going to increase the cost of that revolving credit to fuel their own wealth. So that's another aspect of why, from a more realpolitik standpoint, of why Erdogan is refusing to increase the interest rates. And the other issue, again, going back to the populist nature of his political campaign, is that in appealing to populism in Turkey, what Erdogan has done over the past decade or two is he was the former mayor of Istanbul, and it has always been a thorn on his side that his own city wouldn't support him. So what he wanted to do was flood Istanbul with people from the countryside, supposedly the poor people, the more religious types, the more pious of Turks, to win, to basically control the seat of local Istanbul politics. Because essentially it's kind of like a dune situation. Whoever controls the spice controls the empire. Well, same thing in Istanbul. If you control Istanbul politically, it's much easier to control the whole country, right? Because Istanbul is the economic powerhouse of the country. So he needed his own local people in the government there to facilitate all the things that he was doing. And by doing that, well, two things happened. One is that he encouraged the mass migration of countryside, of rural Turks into Istanbul, where Istanbul immediately ballooned in population. I think it doubled in population within a couple of years. And Istanbul does not have the physical infrastructure to handle this. So there's the political standpoint of him trying to flood the pious into Istanbul so that he could win those local elections. But also there's another aspect of it is getting all these people to move to Istanbul would finance, they would presumably move into these buildings, these new buildings that his cronies are constructing, and that would fuel the growth of their own personal wealth. But because obviously the real estate in Istanbul is already high because it's a desirable city, and giving sweetheart land contracts to your cronies and then them building apartments and skyscrapers and having rural Turks presumably move into them, it's a good operation here that you can cook up. Of course, that didn't really happen. And a lot of these rural Turks became homeless. There's this phenomenon called gece kondu, which means it's buildings or like basically shacks or shanty towns that were put up in the middle of the night where rural Turks were living. So you have like when you go down the highway in Istanbul, you'll see all these random shacks of just people living there. And these just like popped over in the middle of the night. And that's what gece kondu means literally in Turkish, is like put up in the middle of the night. So that obviously wrecked Istanbul as the economic engine of the country. Because just from a personal or from an individual person standpoint, the fact that the infrastructure of Istanbul couldn't handle this doubling size of the population, you look at the average Istanbul person, usually it's kind of like in New York City, where most people in New York live in the outer boroughs, you live in like Bronx or Brooklyn, and then you commute to Manhattan to work, right? You take the bridge or tunnels, go to work, and then you take the bridge and tunnels and go back. It's kind of similar in Istanbul, where usually people lived on the Asian side of Istanbul and then take the bridge to go over to the European side and work and then come back home. And it was bad enough that the population back in the 90s for Istanbul was around 8 million, which is the population of New York City. Not the metropolitan area, because the metropolitan area is larger, but New York City proper is also at 8 million. And New York City has how many bridges and tunnels? At least a dozen, but Turkey only had two, right? And then all of a sudden now the population of Istanbul is 15 million. And just recently they finally built a third bridge, but still it's pretty bad. But not just from the bridge standpoint, but just normal. It's not like, the United States where these are brand new cities. Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium is an old city, is one of the oldest cities in the world. So it's not like you have large boulevards where you can park cars. There was actually a Turkish article. They were saying that if you lined all the cars of Istanbul in the streets, it would exceed by 3 times the amount of street available in Istanbul. So there's lengthwise, there's 3 times more cars than there's actual streets in Istanbul, which means there's physically no room to park cars in Istanbul. And not only that, the traffic is horrible. And there were people where normally the commute back in the 90s, it would take you 20 minutes, half hour to go to work. Now people literally are stuck in traffic for 2, 3 hours. So if your economic engine of Turkey is Istanbul, and but the people physically can't get to work or get back from work because they're stuck in traffic literally a quarter of the day, well, the productive capacity of your supposed economic engine is severely diminished. Plus, that doesn't even consider the fact that, okay, forget about Istanbul for a second. all these rural people, again, Turkey is not like some super industrialized or service economy based country like Europe, Western Europe, or the United States. It's very much an agrarian society. The economy, I should say, is very agrarian. But what Erdogan did by moving all these rural Turks to Istanbul and Ankara, the capital, was that they removed the farmers that were actually producing the agricultural base for the Turkish population. And again, the Turkish population, Turkey is one of the only European countries whose population has ballooned. And so obviously it needs more food, but now you have less farmers, less agricultural workers to actually provide you the food. And of course, you need food. It's not like you can not have food, like we've already discussed. So, what does Turkey do? They have to import their food. So, just from a base standpoint, even though, and normally, like it's fine because a lot of European countries import food too, right? But those European countries are developed nations whose economy is not agrarian based economy, right? They're service or industrial based economy. But Turkey, very much being an agricultural based economy, well, if you're an agricultural based economy and you can't even produce your own agriculture, obviously that's a big red flag. And foreign investors obviously can see that too, which provides further political and economic or societal instability within the country, which further increases the perceived risk premium from foreign investors and further exacerbates the current issue in Turkey. And this is where classical economists will come and say, well, yeah, no, duh. That's the whole point of comparative advantage. You just go import all your agriculture or all the food that you need from Europe or whatever. Okay, well, that's good. But like I said earlier, there's a time delay with trade, and that time delay translates to a real cost in your imports in the form of short-term interest rates. So raising the interest rates is going to make it more expensive for your imports. So the comparative advantage, while again, this is the classic problem of classical economics, is that it all sounds good in theory, just like with Northern bomb sight and the bomb testing in the American ranges. But as soon as you take your bombers over to Germany or Japan or whatever, and you see that your theory doesn't quite work. And here it is again with Turkey, is that, okay, yes, comparative economics theoretically exists, but because of the time delay nature of trade finance and the cost of importing those goods is going to be affected by the interest rates that you're going to have to pay. So, is there a way out of this? Honestly, I don't know because Turkey's stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either they keep the interest rates low to keep propping up unprofitable Turkish lira, or they actually bite the bullet and raise the interest rates, which again doesn't really help from an inflationary standpoint, but at least it brings foreign investment in, which hopefully they could turn the country around. Either way, things are going to get a lot worse before they get better, if they ever get better. And Turkey hasn't really, in its modern history, shown any strong track record of providing evidence to the global economy that it can lay the groundwork for solid fundamentals of a sustained growth in its economy. But hopefully I'm wrong and they can actually, whatever investment they ultimately get, they can actually do that. But at least it acts as a warning sign for us and other countries. The main lesson that we can take from Turkey is that the immediate impacts of monetary policy, whether it's raising interest rates or reducing interest rates, can provide certain effects. What those effects are can always be up to debate because, frankly, there's too many variables for it to be accurately deduced. Monetary policy has always been the equivalent of trying to push a piece of string. Monetary policy will never be as effective as the sound fundamentals of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy being the spending and taxation of the central government as opposed to the central bank. And if in the developed world we've become developed by virtue of the fact of the proper and the good management of, despite our political differences and political turmoils within our respective countries, the fundamentals of the economic growth have always been there, which allowed us to be developed nations. Now you can argue about, well, yeah, that was done on the backs of exploiting the third world and indigenous people, and that's a social issue that we can address. But the lesson we can learn here is not where Turkey is now, but how Turkey got there. And the common theme throughout this entire episode has been about the complete, absolute mismanagement of Turkey's finances and the structuring of the Turkish economy. Specifically, the extreme politicalization or using the economy as a hostage to ensure political hegemony. And that happened because economic decisions were made not for the facilitation of economic growth, but for the consolidation of political power. And unfortunately, this is what I'm seeing happening in the US and also what we're seeing definitely in Eastern Europe, but lately it started to happen in Western Europe too. And now there's all this talk about raising interest rates in the US, well, in the EU too, but anyways, because they're saying, oh, the economy is overheating, the inflation is rising, the same shit that's going on in Turkey, they're saying is happening in the US and the rest of the first world. So they're saying, oh, we got to raise interest rates. And hopefully this episode has been kind of a warning sign to at least pause and consider, hey, should we really be raising interest rates? Because if we reference back to the Curtis LeMay effect, it's not just about what the theory says, it's about what are the conditions on the ground. And we went back and forth about Turkey, said, okay, the theory says we should raise the interest rates, but the theory is wrong because for various different reasons, mostly the time delay in financial transactions. And in reality, we should actually be lowering interest rates. And when you look at this broadly, I shouldn't say conventionally, but broadly speaking, raising interest rates actually raises inflation and lowering interest rates lowers inflation, going back to that espresso analogy. But then again, with Turkey, that's not really the issue. The issue is they need to get their investments in order. They need to get some injection of capital. They basically need an emergency shock. And right now, presumably the easiest way to get that emergency shock or fusion of currency, of money flow, cash flow into their economy is through foreign investment. It's kind of like what they say is, like dietitians will always tell you, oh, sugar is bad, sugar is bad. Well, sugar is only bad if you're in a first world sedentary diet. If you're starving for resources or, if you're feeling a little woozy, sugar is actually the best thing for you because it's the best way to get immediate energy. Now, of course, if you just rely on sugar, then obviously, of course, that's bad because all that immediate energy is going to turn to fat and you're going to have all these other problems and whatnot. But for initial shock of energy, sugar is obviously the best thing, which is why they say for the elderly, they always recommend that you carry like a little tin can of hard candies so that whenever they get lightheaded or woozy, you just pop in one of those hard candies and then you're good to go. And I remember like my grandmother would have like a tin can of these little sour candies, and then she would pop it anytime she felt a little woozy when she needed a little bit of energy. So with Turkey, yes, I did say Turkey should raise its interest rates, but not to combat inflation. It's to encourage the foreign investments so they can actually have some cash flow. And hopefully, Erdogan, even though he won't, but that's neither here nor there. But hopefully, he would take this foreign investment to actually do something sound for the Turkish economy, so that they would have the solid fundamentals as a base to exercise the economic policies that he espouses, which is lowering of the interest rates to keep inflation low and increase economic prosperity, and I guess in his terms bring a rebirth of the Ottoman Empire, which he seems to be obsessed about. But so the methodology may be the same, but the desired effects are different. So I still stand by that the theory is wrong. It's just that this time the blind squirrel has found its nut. And we have to remember that the end goal here is not to combat inflation. Obviously you want to combat inflation, but again, that's not the end goal. The end goal is to do what is best for your citizens. And just like with LeMay, the end goal is not to prove whether the Brits were wrong and that high altitude or low altitude bombing is the best way to go about. The point is to rain destructive firepower on your enemy's manufacturing capacity, and ultimately to win the war. That's the end goal, and that's what we should be focusing on. So when it comes to the United States, or I guess the first world in general, we got to look at what are the economic realities on the ground. All these things that the conservative economists are saying, it's like, oh yeah, we have to raise interest rates to slow down the economy because the inflation is going high up. Well, yeah, okay, broadly speaking, inflation is increasing. Yes, that is absolutely true. But inflation is not just some one-off measure. And inflation is about too much money chasing too few goods. So you just can't focus on the too much money part. You have to also focus on the too few goods. And, it's kind of like, in with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where Thanos, he's got the Infinity Gauntlet, and his whole deal was that the universe is overpopulated, it's overcrowded, so there's a lot of starvation and suffering because there's not enough resources in the universe. So what's his solution? He's going to kill half the people in the universe. And I feel like that's a very classical economist way to think about things. Because yeah, sure, that'll definitely solve the starvation suffering problem. But of course, what you're doing is you're killing half the people.
Little one, it's a simple calculus. This universe is finite, its resource is finite. If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist. It needs correction.
You don't know that!
I'm the only one who knows that. At least I'm the only one with the will to act on it.
There is another way to do it. If you have the power to kill half the people, hey, Thanos, why don't you consider doubling the resources of the universe? Or for the pedants out there, doubling the productive capacity of the universe and accomplish the same exact thing and end suffering without actually, waxing half of the population. So you could either be like Thanos and attack the too much money part of the inflation equation, or you could be a little bit more benevolent and attack the too few goods part. And what's been going on for the past 2 years or so, the COVID pandemic, right? And we have supply chain disruptions everywhere. And we can get into arguments and debates on what are the causes of that, but that's immaterial at this point. What matters is that we have a lot of supply chain shortages, and that's what's causing the inflation. It's the too few goods part. And of course, there are other people, they'll bring out some bullshit metric that they pulled out from some random statistic from the Fed and say, well, no, that's actually not true because of this or that. And look, like we can debate all the different statistics that you want, but it's kind of like voodoo fortune telling, throwing the chicken bones on the trash lid, trying to tell the future, because the statistics that matter are the statistics that are relevant to your citizens. And we could look at household debt, for example, and that has actually been pretty flat. Despite this high rate of inflation, household debt has been relatively flat. And even like we heard about this during the stimulus checks, is that there are reports about how the stimulus checks that came, most American households were using that to pay down the already pre-accumulated debt. So if debt is not increasing, this was the thing back during the Clinton years, was that household or private debt, whatever you want to call it, was increasing, was going through the roof. And therefore, they had to raise the interest rates to cool it down. And sure, and you remember during those years, the Clinton years, much to the chagrin of a lot of GOP, they hate to admit this, is that, we had a field day in the economy. Everything was going amazing and great during those years. People were basically living on their credit card. The bond traders on Wall Street, because my mom was working in Wall Street, she would have all these stories about it, how they'd be like comparing dick sizes, they'd be comparing their credit cards, like, oh look, I got the Amex Black card, or it's like, oh no, I got the Visa. Well, I mean, that doesn't matter if you got the Amex Black card, nothing beats that. But everyone would say, oh, let me get the bill, right? Everyone was trying to one up each other. So when the restaurant bill would come, they'd be like, oh no, I got it. And they would like drop down their credit cards, like, flopping their dicks on the table. It's like, oh, look at mine. I got Visa Platinum. It's like, oh yeah, well, check this out. Bam. I got my Amex Black card. Like, oh shit. Because that was the whole cultural environment back then. Private debt, real household debt, whatever you want to call it, was going through the roof. So, of course, back then it made sense. You wanted to raise interest rates to cool down the economy because people were spending like crazy. But again, you look at statistics now, household debt has, in some sense, in some metrics, has been decreasing from, again, the story about the stimulus checks going towards paying down debt. But just broadly speaking, definitely in the US and more broadly in first world, is that household debt has been relatively flat. I mean, I say relatively because obviously it increased, but it's the first world, of course it's going to increase. We don't need to be a little pedantic about there. And of course, more importantly, business borrowing, because that's the other side of this, right? Is you have the private individuals with their own private consumption, but then you also have the economic powerhouse of a country, which are its businesses. And business borrowing in recent history has been the slowest it's ever been. So you can see here that not only from the private side, but even from the business side, the economic growth has been slow. And this is even despite all those, they made a whole big fanfare, the Democrats, about, oh, look, we passed this huge COVID relief bill, and this is all great. It's going to help businesses out and everything like that. No, it didn't do shit because, you can just look at the numbers yourself. It's that even without the offering of all these cheap loans for the pandemic, business borrowing is still at I shouldn't say all-time low, but as far as recent history is concerned, like the last decade, business borrowing is, we'll just call it anemic at best. So raising the interest rates on an already flat private and business debt metric is going to do little to no good. And again, when you talk about how the fact that businesses rely on low interest rates to finance their operations, that's only going to hurt the first world. So again, the problem is not easy credit because we already have easy credit. Both households and businesses have it. So we do have this cheap and easy money, which presumably means that we have plenty of money available in the economy. But if we have all this available money for us and the economy is still slow, well, then the only other option that we have to consider is the supply side, which of course makes sense given the pandemic. And everyone knows, anyone trying to buy a car or GPU or PS5 can readily attest to the fact that the supply chain is in shambles right now. And of course, we can also go into the fact about labor force participation rates and like unemployment, or more importantly, underemployment, because this is another way that classical economists will try to get you. They'll point directly at the unemployment rates and completely ignore the underemployment rates, right? Because the people, especially with the United States, how a lot of your benefits are tied to actually being employed. People are in such a bad position right now, they'll just take any job they can get their hands to just so they can get insurance or some sort of other type of federal or local benefit. And that doesn't mean that they're gainfully employed. It just means that they're in such bad conditions that they're essentially reduced to what I would consider, one level above slavery or an indentured servitude. So you should always be careful when the economists say, oh, look at the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate is a bullshit statistic, and you have to look at the overall labor market participation rates. We can go into a separate long-winded conversation on the difference between U3 versus U6 unemployment, but that's a story for another time. So labor force participation rates is down, and then even in business circles, we like to talk about capacity. There's this like obscure statistic called capacity utilization rate, and that's been down by over 3%. Capacity utilization rate is just like fancy term, broadly speaking, for your industrial sector. And with that down, when we're talking about supply chains, it's obviously those two are inexplicably linked together, and that industry is very reliant on supply chains. And so when you have supply chain reductions or disruptions, that affects your industrial capacity. And also from the financial aspect of it, again, one of the biggest sectors that are heavily reliant on short-term financial instruments, short-term loans and what have you, facilitating trade finance, is the industrial sector. So with the industrial sector being down by 3% or so, which doesn't sound like much, but in economics terms, it's a big fucking deal, as Joe Biden would say. It matters. And we just can't just blindly or arbitrarily say, oh yeah, let's just raise the interest rates because inflation is high. There's a lot more that goes into that number. And it's not just about inflation, because inflation inherently means two different things. Too much money chasing too few goods. All these metrics that I just spent all this time ad nauseum talking about is pointing to the fact that, hey, we do have enough money in the economy. It's just that we'd have too few goods. We need to increase the productive capacity. We need to increase the goods. Just anecdotally, Ronald Reagan, he would famously say, oh, are you better now than you were 4 years ago? Just go around asking people, How is their disposable income? Most people say they have disposable income is shit. But can I really blame, in some sense, you can't really blame the Fed for saying these things because they're mandated to stabilize the economy. They have the dual mandate of maintaining a low unemployment rate and stable prices, or as most people would say, low inflation. So, not to sound cliche, but the old adage goes, if you have a hammer, then everything starts looking like a nail. And the Fed, they only have one way, one effective way to regulate the economy, and that's the raising or lowering of interest rates. Well, if the interest rate's already at zero, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to raise it. So from their mind, obviously the only thing they can really do is raise the interest rates. And when you have theories that saying, oh, well, raising interest rates will lower inflation, well, it's an easy choice for them. Because when everyone around you is saying, oh yeah, high altitude precision bombing works, well then yeah, you're going to follow. It's easy to go on and follow on and say, oh yeah, we should totally do high altitude precision bombing. It takes a big man to step forward and challenge the prevailing wisdom to do what's right. With the Fed's dual mandate, their job is to control and affect monetary supply. So the only thing the Fed can do is affect monetary policy, which when we're talking about inflation being too much money chasing too few goods, well, obviously they have no bearing or no effect on the too few goods part because they're a central bank. The only thing they can do is address the too much money part. So if you have inflation, and in their mind, again, with the hammer and the nail analogy, well, the only thing that they can see is, oh, there's too much money economy, we need to constrict it. Or in other terms, too much money chasing too few goods. Well, too much money is the demand part, and too few goods is the supply part. So the only thing that the Fed can do is affect demand. And that's why classical economists always say, oh, you got to reduce demand to reduce inflation. But the Fed, all they can do is affect that demand side vis-a-vis monetary policy. The supply side, which is the too few goods part, can only be affected by the actual government in question, the central government in question. And this is one of my main problems with classical economists, or specifically, I shouldn't shit on all classical economists, but a major subset of them is supply side economics. Supply side economics makes no sense because it's pretty much popularized by Ronald Reagan. He's really big into supply side economics, but he also famously would say that, oh, the problem with the government is the government. He always said the scariest words in the English language they hear is, I am from the government and I'm here to help. Well, you can't say that stupid quip and then also be a supply side economist, because I just established here that the only entity that can affect the supply side is the government. So you're either going to have to be a supply side economist and pro big government, or say, I'm against big government and I'm going for the demand side. Obviously, it's a marriage of both because it's a balance between too much money and too few goods. It's a balance between the demand and the supply, but the Fed can only do the demand side, whereas it's up to the government to address the supply. And if the government doesn't address the supply, well, the Fed ends up taking control of the economy, and the only thing that they can do, again, I don't want to blame the Fed. The Fed is just doing what it's trying to do. I mean, I can blame the Fed. They could just not do anything and actually educate people, just educate the public and say, look, this is not a demand issue, this is a supply issue. But that's, regardless, that's besides the point. The point here is that if the government abdicates its responsibility in addressing its own economy, well, then the only thing left to do is to rely on a central bank, right? And if you only look at the money supply part and ignore the productive capacity side of the mark, well, you end up just like Turkey, where we just spent all this entire episode talking about the gross mismanagement of the Turkish economy by Erdogan, by the Turkish president. And in this case, especially in America, I would say the United States government has grossly mismanaged the United States economy, but in this case, it's not in a malicious sense as it is with Erdogan, but it's just an abdication responsibility. Ever since George W. Bush left office, we've had over a decade of political gridlock leading to the abdication of the government's management of its own economy, which has led to such a fragile state of affairs for our productive capacity and supply chain that all it took was some guy in China eating a bad bowl of soup to send the world's greatest economy into a complete and utter disarray. But we can't just get on Twitter and start shouting at each other because A, that's not going to help with changing the discourse. But more importantly, the point here being that lately the West is starting to use, or the Western politicians are starting to use the economy as a political weapon, just like Erdogan has been doing so in Turkey. I mean, again, this is the whole point, the reason why we've enshrined that central banks should be independent, because the management of the economy should be relatively independent from political squabbling. Well, here now we have it, not necessarily on the monetary side, but definitely on the fiscal side. We've lost that independence, or at least I should say the bipartisanship or coalitionship if you're European. I don't even know if that's a real word. But this is a dangerous path to be on, as Turkey has readily demonstrated. But we just can't shout on social media to affect this change. So the thing about Curtis LeMay is that, okay, right now, ex post facto, from a historical perspective, we're looking and talking about Curtis LeMay and his career and the effect that he had during World War II and saying, oh my God, look at him. He's such a genius and all the things that he did. He's such a great man, yada, yada, yada. But you have to remember that at the time that this was all going on, he was going against the grain. He was going against the conventional theory. And as far as the economists are concerned, he was in the heterodoxy as opposed to the orthodoxy. And ultimately, economics, as well as military theory as well, it's a social science, and it implies convincing or affecting change with people. And during the time of Curtis LeMay's career, he didn't make too many friends. Matter of fact, he made a lot of enemies. And in retrospect, he was proven right. But of course, people that were interacting with him at the time obviously didn't know that. People did not like him, and he made a lot of enemies. And despite raising up to the level of Chief of Staff of the Air Force, which is the highest position that an officer in the Air Force can achieve, he was not taken seriously by the civilian leadership, by the president. And this was readily evident during the Vietnam War, where during the commencement of the Vietnam War, after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, basically it authorized LBJ, President Johnson, to essentially carry out the Vietnam War. Curtis LeMay was a big advocate of, okay, well, we basically got to bomb them into the Stone Age. There's a misattributed quote about him saying that we're going to bomb the North Vietnamese back to the Stone Age. Of course, LeMay later on in certain interviews says, no, I never actually said that. I just said we have the capacity to bomb them back to the Stone Age. But, whatever. That's neither here nor there. But because he was so against the grain, he didn't follow conventional theory, others in the military leadership convinced President Johnson, convinced LBJ to go with what we call a tactical bombing, or bombing with fighter aircraft. And obviously Curtis LeMay, he was completely against this. He would say flying fighters is fun, but flying bombers is important. And nowadays, military historians will look at this and say, yeah, it was pretty stupid to go with fighters, because the whole point of fighters is their aerial maneuverability, and loading on a bunch of bombs on them weighs them down and slows them down, which negates the whole aerial prowess of these platforms. And of course, we know all through history of countless POWs during the Vietnam War of how many fighters got shot down by anti-aircraft and anti-air artillery fire by the North Vietnamese. And despite his powerful position and despite all his success that he's had in his career, the United States essentially ignored the sound advice. Well, I wouldn't call it advice. With LeMay, it was more like a overt demand. But either way, the United States ignored the advice of its highest-ranking Air Force general. And it wasn't until he retired, and about 8 years and a president later with Richard Nixon, 1972, finally Nixon said, you know what, this whole piecemeal bombing bullshit that we've been doing in the Vietnam War is stupid. with fighters. Let's just bring in our bombers. And this is the famous Operation Linebacker, more specifically Operation Linebacker 2, which is a seminal moment in modern air power history because it showed in a lot of sense that the United States could have won the war if the air power was managed properly. So with Operation Linebacker 2, we finally did strategic bombing, which is what LeMay wanted 8 years ago. And only then did the North Vietnamese capitulate, or I'm using quote capitulate, and actually come to the peace table and sign a treaty, which is what we wanted at that point, which is what we wanted to do to end the war and get out. And even though LeMay was right, because of his blowhard nature, people didn't listen to him. The point here is that being right doesn't mean you're going to be heard. Being right and having the track record, the past performance, showing that you're right doesn't mean you're going to be heard either. You know, as they say in Wall Street, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So who knows what would have happened? You know, this is a good, historical what if scenario to kind of think about. You know, Einstein do the Gedanken experiment. What would have happened in the Vietnam War had LBJ listened to Curtis LeMay and actually started with strategic bombing from the get-go? Maybe the United States would have actually won the Vietnam War. And this is the parallel that I want to bring back to the current situation with the economy, is that we don't want the Fed to raise interest rates with the assumption that raising the interest rates is going to combat inflation, because as we just explained, what in reality it's going to do is destroy the already fragile recovery from this COVID pandemic recession. And what we don't want to be, just like with Curtis LeMay, is 8 years from now say, I told you so. So the challenge is being like Curtis LeMay and taking the theory and seeing how it applies to the real conditions on the ground. But simultaneously, the challenge is not to be like him and actually be heard so that we can avoid another 8 years of needless suffering. If you would like to comment on this podcast or on the topics covered within it, or you'd like us to raise a new topic in our next episode, please feel free to leave us a message or voicemail on www.codbsm.com. That's Charlie Oscar Delta, Bravo Sierra Mike.com. Thank you for listening, and see you at the potty, Richter.